On December 17th, the Lok Sabha witnessed a fiery discussion for 90 minutes. The members of parliament debated whether the government had the right to introduce a constitutional amendment bill which proposes to align the election cycles of Lok Sabha and all the state assemblies in India. What has come to be known as One Nation, One Election.
This bill will finish off regional parties. This bill is only brought in to massage the ego of the supreme leader.
अगर इनको लगता है कि प्रधानमंत्री मोदी जी पर के प्रचार से ये पूरे ये भारत के चुनाव को छीनेंगे तो हम ये चोरी नहीं होने देंगे और हम बिल का विरोध करते हैं।
आज इतिहास बनाने का अवसर आया है। मैं जेपीसी में भेजने का भी प्रस्ताव करता हूं और अगर आपकी अनुमति हो कि वे दोनों आइटम आई इंट्रोड्यूस द बिल आल्सो।
It is Friday, the 20th of December. From the Economic Times, I'm your host Nidhi Sharma, and you listening to the Morning Brief. In this episode, we will deconstruct what is One Nation, One Election concept, what is the 129th constitutional amendment introduced by the government in Lok Sabha, and why the opposition is protesting against it. But let's start from the very basics. Last week, the Union Cabinet approved two bills, the 129th Constitutional Amendment and the Union Territories Laws Amendment Bill. Through the two bills, the government is trying to synchronize electoral cycles across India. The statement of objects and reasons in the bill, which defines the reasoning behind any legislation, says there is an imperative need for holding of simultaneous elections for various reasons, and given that elections have become expensive and time-consuming. The imposition of model code of conduct in several parts of the country which are poll-bound put on hold the entire development programs, cause disruption of normal public life, impact the functioning of services, and also curtail the involvement of manpower from their core activities for deployment for prolonged periods for election duties. So there, the government says that holding of simultaneous elections would save time and resources. Historically, this is not the first time that India is talking about simultaneous elections. When the country adopted the constitution and started holding its elections, the Lok Sabha and state assembly elections were conducted simultaneously in 1951, 57, 62 and 1967. Here is when India witnessed a break. 1967 election saw the rise of regional parties and anti-Congressism, with coalition governments taking shape in at least 8 states. These weren't very stable and led to several assemblies getting dissolved before their 5-year term ended. Even the 4th Lok Sabha was dissolved prematurely in 1970. This is where the synchronized election cycle was disrupted. Now, the NDA government wants to once again align the electoral process. So how does the Constitutional Amendment Bill do that? It says that Lok Sabha and state assemblies will have a common start date and expiration of a 5-year term. In case a state assembly or Lok Sabha is dissolved before the end of this term, fresh elections will be called, but this assembly or Lok Sabha will not have a 5-year term. Instead, it will serve only the remaining part of the previous assembly or Lok Sabha's term. So in case a government falls within 2 years of coming to power, fresh elections are called, and then the new government will not have a 5-year term, but only a 3-year term. Sounds complicated? Let's turn to Chakshu Roy, Head of Legislative and Civic Engagement at PRS Legislative Research, an independent research institute on legislative processes, and all things Parliament. Welcome to the Morning Brief, Chakshu.
Thank you for having me, Nidhi.
So, Chakshu, can you tell us the salient features of the two constitutional amendment bills introduced in Lok Sabha earlier this week?
So, the idea is that the two constitutional amendments would pave the way for simultaneous elections for both Lok Sabha and state legislative assemblies, and the calendar for the elections will be synced so that both the general elections and the state elections across the country happen at the same time. Now, according to the government, the rationale behind it is that when elections are spread out, then there is a loss in governance momentum, and perhaps that elections that are spread out and held at different times are not as efficient as elections which is simultaneous or together would bring about.
Chakshu, why are the regional parties fearing that they would be at a disadvantage as compared to national parties if elections are conducted simultaneously?
From what members of parliament have said, either in opinion columns or on the floor of the House, or even during when regional parties gave their representations to the President COVID committee, I think there are a few concerns. Some of them come from, will regional parties have the same amount of resources required to be able to fight a national and a state election at the same time? That's one. The other is, when elections are held for Lok Sabha and state at the same time, will the electorate be able to distinguish between voting on national issues for a national election and regional issues for a regional election? And perhaps also, they are not very clear as to what happens in case of legislative assemblies where there is a hung assembly or a government loses a majority during the middle of its 5-year term. So I think some of those things are cause of concern for regional parties.
So in the bills, as I was reading them, it clearly says that if a legislative assembly's term ends or it has to be dissolved before the term of the Lok Sabha or the term of the legislative assembly, that would be called unexpired term. And it would end when the original assembly was supposed to end. Could you tell us more about this? What does it mean and what does it entail for the government of the day?
Nidhi, you're right in the way you have pointed out as to how things will take place, but I'd like to elaborate on this a little bit more. So for our listeners, the Constitution says that our elected legislatures, Lok Sabha and state legislatures, have a 5-year term. The idea would be that every 5 years, elections will take place together for Lok Sabha and all the legislative assemblies. Now, in a system like ours, which is a Westminster system, there is a possibility that an elected government might lose its majority on the floor of the House. So that's another thing to be thought about as to what will be political parties' strategy, that if a government falls after 3 years and elections have to take place, will candidates stand for elections, spend that amount of money to be elected for 2 years and then go in for elections again after 2 years?
So in 1967 general elections, this cycle of simultaneous elections was disrupted. Could you tell us more about how different was that scenario from the current one?
If we look at our electoral history, the first general elections, Lok Sabha, states, everything starts in 1951-52. Until about 67, by and large, there are, single party governments, stable governments, and everybody is able to complete their 5-year tenure. So the simultaneous elections during that part of our history were not by constitutional design, but by the fact that governments had a majority and they were able to complete their terms. 67, what happens is that the country witnesses rise of regional parties, regional players, and in a number of cases, regional parties, along with their allies, are able to form governments. Now, some of these governments do not last the full 5-year term. Then, elections are called so that a new set of legislators can come and the government can have a majority on the floor of the House. And this also then changed for Lok Sabha, because if we fast forward to the 90s, there were Lok Sabhas which did not last a full term. In the last 75 years, there were conversations about having simultaneous elections, but the ones that were simultaneous were not by legislative or constitutional design, but by the fact that they were, governments that lasted full terms.
So in your assessment, Chakshu, how does this help or not help?
Nidhi, I think what should be the rationale for elections? This is something that members of parliament will be debating extensively on the floor of the House and possibly even in committee. And one rationale that has been talked about extensively is that elections represent the will of the people, and should efficiency in the election process be a big enough argument to say that it will have to come at the cost of cutting down the tenure of certain legislatures. The President Cohen Committee did some calculations about the amount of administrative efficiency or governance efficiency it will bring, but members of parliament might also want to discuss, if elections are all held together, would there be a governance slowdown in the entire country at one particular point of time? And one last thing is that there will also need to have some deliberations as to whether these constitutional amendments would require ratification by state legislatures or not. There is currently not full clarity on that issue. So that is something that would need to be thought about. In case of constitutional amendment bills, there is a special 2/3 majority that is required for the bills to be passed by each house. And there is also an additional safeguard, which is that in case the two houses disagree on the text of the bills, then in case of constitutional amendment bills, unlike other deadlock, there is no provision for a joint sitting. So I think there are, varying issues. It's a subject that will require not only constitutional deliberation, it will require deliberation with states, deliberation with election commission and their ability to be able to manage an election of this magnitude, whereas the entire Lok Sabha and 4,000 odd MLA constituencies going into polls. So there is going to be a lot of food for thought, and people will bring in varying perspectives one way or the other, and then I think our parliament would then take decisions.
The NDA government brought one nation, one election back into the conversation in 2023 when it constituted a committee under former President Ram Nath Kovind to examine the issue in detail. Kovind Committee submitted its recommendations to the President in March this year. The basic logic of the government is improved administrative efficiency. But the opposition feels it is a way to subvert democracy and steer elections in favor of the BJP. The basic fear is that if the elections are conducted simultaneously, a voter would not differentiate between Assembly and Lok Sabha and vote for the same party. But the opposition is not going into this at all. It is challenging the government over its right to even introduce the constitutional amendment. We have with us Manish Tiwari, Congress's Lok Sabha MP and spokesperson, explaining this to us. Welcome to the Morning Brief, Manish ji.
Thank you very much, Nidhi ji. It's always a pleasure having a conversation with you.
Why is the Congress opposing the government's move on one nation, one election?
Because it fundamentally assaults the basic structure of the Constitution. Let me explain it to you a little bit. You see, going back to 1951, there was a seminal judgment of the Supreme Court of India in the Zamindari abolition cases called the Sankri Prasad versus Union of India. And then there was the Golaknath judgment in the mid-60s or late 60s, which held that Parliament had no right to legislate fundamental rights out of the Constitution. Then there was the famous Kesavanand Bharati judgment of 1973, in which the Supreme Court conceptualized the basic structure doctrine, which essentially means that there are certain features of the Constitution which are beyond the amending power of Parliament under Article 368, because they would alter the fundamental character of the Constitution, disfigure it, mutilate it, eviscerate it beyond recognition. So when the Kesavanand Bharati judgment was written, how did the judges understand parliamentary democracy? They understood parliamentary democracy to mean parliamentary democracy as it existed, which is that there is a union legislature, there are state legislatures, and there is local self-government. What I am trying to simply point out is the fundamental infirmity in introducing a bill which is beyond the legislative competence of the House. The Article 368 is circumscribed in terms of its ability to be able to amend the Constitution of India by the basic structure doctrine. In fact, taking from India's experience and the wisdom of the higher judiciary in India, a large number of countries around the world have actually incorporated the basic structure doctrine into the very body of their respective constitutions. We should have done that. Unfortunately, for reasons best known to successive generations of politicians and governments, we failed to do that. But be that as it may, the judge-made law stands.
So the demand that the opposition had of a joint parliamentary committee, even that is not acceptable.
Fundamentally, the union and the states are co-equal partners in the constitutional scheme. The union does not take precedence over the states. Article 1 of the Constitution of India says that India is a union of states and not vice versa. So how can you make the term of the state legislatures subject and subservient to the term of the union legislature? It is not possible under the constitutional scheme. And that's the fundamental objection.
This can also be challenged in court, Manishi.
When it becomes an act, it will go to court. But what I'm saying is, why enact an unconstitutional law? In any case, you are doing an academic kite flying. This will only come into play in 2034, 10 years down the line. All the elections held to the state assemblies between 2024 and 2029, their terms would expire post 2029. Therefore, only the elections which are held post 2029 would the terms of those assemblies be aligned by cutting them with the term of the national legislature. Hypothetically speaking, that by 2034, you have aligned the terms of all the state legislatures and the national legislature. And then the national legislature gets dissolved in 1 year. What happens to those state legislatures which have been elected for 5 years? Are you going to have elections all across the country then after 1 year? So this bill is riddled with lacunae and contradictions, and it's a minefield of legal nightmares.
Smaller opposition parties feel it will lead to horse trading. Let's hear what AAP's Rajya Sabha MP Sanjay Singh has to say.
संजय जी, वन नेशन वन इलेक्शन को आपकी पार्टी का मत है कि नहीं?
देखिए, वन नेशन वन इलेक्शन को हम लोग ये मानते हैं कि इस देश में तानाशाही लाने की एक कोशिश है और इससे जो डेमोक्रेसी के अंदर लोगों को वोट का अधिकार मिला हुआ है कि वो 5 साल में एक बार अपनी सरकार को चुने और अगर सरकार अल्पमत में है, नहीं चलती है, तो दोबारा अपना वोट दें। आप उस पूरी धारणा को खत्म कर रहे हैं। अगर कोई सरकार अल्पमत में आएगी तो तोड़फोड़ करके भारतीय जनता पार्टी नई सरकार बना लेगी। तो देश भर के अंदर हॉर्स ट्रेडिंग, खरीद फरोख्त, विधायकों को डराना धमकाना, अपनी पार्टी में मिलाना और 5 साल तक सरकार चलाना, ये प्राथमिकता हो जाएगी बीजेपी की। एक बात और मैं कहना चाहूंगा कि जब भी कोई नेता इलेक्शन में जाता है तो उसके मन में डर होता है कि जनता हमसे सवाल पूछेगी। इसीलिए कई बार हम लोग देखते हैं कि जब राज्यों का चुनाव होता है तो सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट को भी पेट्रोल डीजल गैस के दाम कम करने होते हैं, अपने सारे टैक्सेस में कमी लानी होती है, क्योंकि उनको स्टेट के इलेक्शन में जवाब देना होता है। तो इसलिए जब इलेक्शन ही 5 साल में एक बार होगा तो सरकार के अंदर तानाशाही का आचरण और मजबूत होगा, क्योंकि जो राज्य की सरकारें होंगी उनको लगेगा हमें 5 साल तक तो कोई हटा नहीं सकता। जो केंद्र की सरकार होगी उसको ये लगेगा कि भाई हम अगर 2,500 का भी सिलेंडर बेचेंगे और 250 रुपए लीटर भी पेट्रोल बेचेंगे और 200 रुपए डीजल भी बेचेंगे तो कोई हमें 5 साल तक तो हटाने वाला नहीं है फिलहाल। तो ये एक जो तानाशाही की प्रवृत्ति है वो ज़्यादा बढ़ेगी और मैं समझता हूं कि वन नेशन वन इलेक्शन संविधान की मूल धारणा के खिलाफ है और लोकतांत्रिक अधिकार जो देश की जनता को वोट का दिया गया है उसके खिलाफ है।
The bill has been referred to a 31-member joint parliamentary committee which will examine it carefully and then submit its report to the Lok Sabha. Any change in the law would require not a simple majority but 2/3 of the members of the House present and voting, as Chakshu Roy has explained to us. At the time of introduction of the bill, the opposition had sought division of votes. It was a game of optics. It wanted to prove that the government did not have 2/3 majority to push the bill through. But that's for later. Hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of The Morning Brief. I'm your host, Nidhi Sharma, signing off. This episode was brought to you by sound designer Indraneel Bhattacharjee and producer Neil Ghai. Executive producers Anirban Chaudhary and Arijit Burman. Thank you for listening, and if you like this episode, do spread the word. All new episodes of the Morning Brief podcast drop every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. It streams on Amazon Prime Music, JioSaavn, Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. And, of course, ET's own audio platform, ET Play. Have a great weekend. All clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits mentioned in the description.